Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Of course, I'm your host, Brandon, and you're listening to Don't Worry, We'll Talk It Out. Of course, you can see I'm back on YouTube now. If you're watching this video podcast, thank you. If you don't have time to watch the video, of course, you can check this out on all audio streaming platforms like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google, Stitcher. We're on everything, okay? This episode, as you can tell by the title, is about vaccines. This is a very complex and controversial topic. So in order to really flesh out all of the complexity of what's actually happening here, I've split this conversation into three specific categories. And I think that'll be able to really flesh out a number of the topics that we need to discuss, whether it's vaccine development, whether it's anti-vaccine ideology, or the politicization of the virus and the vaccine. So let's go ahead and get started, guys. Sit back, relax, because don't worry, we'll talk it out. On January 20th, I came on this podcast for the first time and mentioned a word that I was pretty unfamiliar with at the time: COVID. It was just popping up in Wuhan, and nearly 12 months later, here we are. The light at the end of the tunnel, of this long and dark tunnel, seems to be getting a little brighter with the development of vaccines. But before we're in the clear, there are so many discussions that need to be had about how we actually got here and what the future could look like. I think all these things need to be discussed before we even feel comfortable going back to the old way of life, whatever that was. As I mentioned, I'm going to split this conversation into three specific categories. So let's start with number one. Number one, a brief history of vaccines. In 1921, an important drug and hormone by the name of insulin was discovered. Before that, anyone who was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes had about 3 to 5 years to live after their diagnosis. Insane to think about nowadays. This incredible scientific endeavor was through the work of only 3 Canadian scientists. 30 years later, the disease of polio was ravaging America, especially its youth. Every year in the 1950s, nearly 30,000 individuals, mostly infants, would die of the polio disease. Other than the old reliable method of quarantining, there really wasn't much people can do until Jonas Salk and his team of scientists worked to create a vaccine for polio in less than 3 years' time. One of history's worst illnesses is smallpox. In its worst form, this disease has a death rate of nearly 30% in comparison to the coronavirus, which worldwide estimates seem to be around 0.8 to about 1.2%. After decades and decades of tough research, by 1980, smallpox has pretty much been eradicated worldwide. I bring up these examples because it's really no surprise that vaccines in general have revolutionized global health. I mean, it's arguably the most single important innovation in human history. As of right now, well, of course, before this year, we never really knew a world that was plagued by disease and ravaged by shorter lifespans. Which brings us to where we are today. As most are aware, several companies like Moderna and Pfizer have worked for months to prepare the upcoming vaccines. But what separates this moment from other historical vaccine developments is that the entire world, for the past 10 months, have only had one thing on their mind. Of course, the international scientific community is all responsible for the incredible speed at which the vaccines are being developed. But ironically, the speed at which these vaccines have been produced has put loads of doubt and anxiety into the general public about even taking them in the first place. Now, all of this is understandable. We are in an unprecedented situation, and it can create immense amounts of fear in people. But before I get into my second topic, I want to try to explain exactly what is in this vaccine, because I think that will clear up a lot of confusion before I get into the real meat of this discussion about anti-vax ideology and politicization of the vaccine. So I'm going to use the Pfizer vaccine as an example, even though there's not really much that separates it from the Moderna vaccine, but let's just go through it. This vaccine only has 4 ingredients, guys. So we got mRNA, you got lipids, you got salt, and you got sugar. That's it. So let me explain these 4 things really quickly. You got mRNA. If anyone's not familiar with mRNA, this stands for messenger RNA. So what this mRNA does is that it targets a specific protein that is released during the SARS-CoV-2 virus when it's actually inside of you, right? So what happens is, let's say you go in and you get your shot for a vaccine. Once you get this shot, that's where the mRNA is going to be injected into your arm. And that's going to start to trigger your immune system. So if you ever get in contact with the actual coronavirus, the idea is that your immune system is already prepared enough to actually battle it, and you wouldn't even know that you had it necessarily. So the second part is lipids, right? If anyone's not familiar with what the lipid is essentially fat, right? And this fat goes around the mRNA. mRNA is a little unstable, right? So the fat goes around to protect it. I'm sure everyone is familiar with what salt is, but the salt is there to keep your pH levels in your body in balance so you can stay in homeostasis, right? You can stay in a good balance once you get the vaccine so it doesn't harm you in the end, right? And the last part is, of course, sugar. Everyone loves sugar. But what the sugar does is kind of acts as an adhesive, right? It keeps everything stuck together in the vaccine so things don't go floating away in your body all of a sudden. And that's it, guys. It's just those 4 ingredients. No preservatives, no fetal matter, no blood, no pork, and certainly no microchips, brought to you by Bill Gates. That's all that's in this vaccine, guys. So let's go ahead and get into the second topic. Paranoia, distrust, and Robert F. Kennedy. In America, there has been a deep distrust in even the mildest of safety precautions since the start of the quarantine. I mean, do we expect the same crowd refusing to wear a mask inside a Target to take not 1, but 2 doses of a brand new vaccine? In an ironic twist, society might not even save itself. Now, several key segments of the population have varied reasons for having distrust and or paranoia of vaccines, especially a brand new one. So I'm going to get into some of these. So let's start with the Black and brown community. In many Black and brown communities, there is a deep-seated distrust in either government-sanctioned medical experiments or just the government in general. Some may remember what is called the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Most of us probably learned this in high school or our intro to psychology class in college. These experiments took place over a 40-year period in Alabama, from the 1930s to around 1972. In this study, Black men were told that they'd be getting free medical care, but were also denied treatment for their syphilis for decades. Crucial information about the experiment was withheld from these communities, and even though penicillin was well known to be a drug that helped to hinder the symptoms of syphilis, was never given to any of the Black populations. America has a pretty disturbing history of experimenting with Black bodies, and that history remains quite fresh. Now, this distrust in vaccines continues, especially in the American left. The left has a history of skepticism, not in vaccines per se, but in the pharmaceutical corporations that have put profits over health for decades. Again, this is all certainly justifiable. I think back to the nearly 600% price increase in EpiPens about a decade ago. Why did Big Pharma increase the price of something that normally takes $3 to $5 to make to nearly $500 and $600? Well, because they could. Martin Shkreli, who was an infamous former pharma executive who's now in prison for fraud, defended these rises in medical care costs by this horrendous statement.
Raised it higher and made more profits for our shareholders, which is my primary duty. And again, no one wants to say it, no one's proud of it, but this is a capitalist society, capitalist system, and capitalist rules. And my investors expect me to maximize profits, not to minimize them or go half or go 70%, but to go to 100%.
This distrust seen in the left and directed at Big Pharma drives major cynicism about the motives of these private corporations. The anti-vax movement has been around for a few decades, and I believe it's caused serious damage to trust in vaccine safety. People like disgraced physician Andrew Wakefield, responsible for the anti-vax movies Vax and its sequel, were hugely responsible for the debunked claim that MMR vaccines cause autism in children. But during the quarantine, the heir to the Kennedy name has become a super spreader of medical misinformation. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the nephew of JFK, has spent ample amounts of time buying nearly 55% of the anti-vax ads seen on Facebook. But what separates this movement is its sly way of manipulating scientific information while claiming that they are pro-vaccine safety. His websites merge real scientific information with pseudoscience, and it can make it tough to distinguish reality from fiction, even from someone like me who has at least a background in STEM and a little bit of a background in infectious disease research. These anti-vaccine movements are more perverse than I think people realize. It's been adopted into the mainstream media through well-known celebrities like Jessica Biel, political commentator Bill Maher, and actor and comedian Jim Carrey. Most of this ideology is a deeply American one, though, and it's the belief that each individual is solely responsible for their own well-being and their happiness. Once this ideology is paired with one person with a bit of power, the ability to sow doubt about vaccines grows exponentially. And this is why it doesn't take much for a person, especially say a concerned parent, to go from being vaccine hesitant to then claiming that their child now has autism because of getting a measles vaccine. It really doesn't take much to go from a kind of a full frontal anti-vax movement. And that's kind of what I'm getting at here. And no matter how much evidence you show them that that's not true, being exposed to anti-vaccine rhetoric will only increase doubt and sow fear and discord in the general population. A culmination of the mistrust seen in these various groups, along with the politicized coronavirus response, has left us in quite a precarious position, which leads to my third and final portion. Number 3, our last option. If anyone has spent any time since March looking at other countries and how they've handled the coronavirus, you'd realize the answers are a little bit sporadic and a lot more complex than some would have you realize. What worked effectively for some countries proved detrimental to others, and the timing of the quarantine measures proved to be incredibly important, as the top 5 most infected countries, Brazil, Mexico, the UK, India, and America, all had the slowest responses to the coronavirus pandemic. Certain nations focused totally on quarantines, social distancing, and the closing of businesses, where others like Taiwan used technology to track cases and even provided citizens who tested positive with, get this, a quarantine hotel and a quarantine cab to get them there. Sweden, the UK, and the Netherlands participated in herd immunity, a dangerous and, frankly, doomed to fail idea that only worsened the country's cases and deaths. And of course, the varied responses seen in America has made our response pretty much the worst in the world. Now, this is mostly because of the different strategies that are relative to each state in America, along with the president, who would ponder aloud on numerous occasions if the virus was even real. All of this leads me to feel that this vaccine is literally our last option as a nation and as a globalist society. I mean, we've been writing on the thoughts and hopes of a vaccine for months. And to find out that these clinical trials are producing at above 90% is literally a historical achievement. It's insane. History will look back on this moment with hundreds of stories. And let's be honest, most will be bad, but some, and very few, will be very, very good. And I think this moment is one of the good ones. This moment that we're going to be experiencing for, well, now and for the next months to come could be an incredible moment for both society and humanity as a whole. The varying levels of distrust in this vaccine are certainly important areas to address. Whether it's distrust in science, the government, or Big Pharma, they're all important areas to address, but they must be met not with criticism, but just firm communication. I don't think anti-vaxxers are inherently bad people. I think they're fearful and they're anxious. And as you can tell by my title, even I am hopefully anxious. But there is a level to actually criticize someone without completely thinking that they're a terrible person because they've been led to believe something that sometimes can be quite difficult to understand. And the efficacious rates of vaccines is certainly a topic that the large majority of the American public are not always familiar with, and the ways in which vaccine development goes. So I think it's important to stay empathetic and try to sympathize with a lot of individuals who may truly believe that their measles vaccine gave their child autism. Now, to close this discussion, I would like to say that the science during these months has not been perfect, right? Flawed research at the start of the pandemic made it more confusing. The WHO and the CDC has made grave errors in communication, and these would go on to influence a number of misguided political ideas and policies. But at the end of this tunnel is still a very bright light, and I believe a huge moment for the future. At its worst, science can be a field of self-interested individuals, where both truth and curiosity are put aside for money, fame, or power. But at its best, science is a rigorous philosophy that admits when it's wrong and searches for answers that will better humanity. I think that's going to do it for me, guys. Thank you, as always, for listening. This has been my little conversation about vaccines, anti-vax ideology, and potentially the future of science. I'll be coming back soon. I would love to do a discussion on the future of journalism, because I do feel that, of course, journalism is incredibly important, and maybe the failures and achievements of the mass media over this past year, I think, is very relevant, especially with the distribution of vaccines. I think it's important to bring all of those things to surface. So I think that will be my next YouTube video. If you'd like, check back on new episodes right here, or you can subscribe to the channel right here. Thank you so much for listening, guys. I've been Randon, and you've been listening to Don't Worry, We'll Talk It Out.